Hi there, it is Miss Agnes, and today's read aloud is going to be part 1, the beginning of Daisy Miller, a study by Henry James. This is a novella, which means that it is between a short story and a novel in its length. So we won't read all of part 1, but we'll read some of it. And it's about some Americans who are living in / visiting Europe. At the little town of Vevey, in Switzerland, there's a particularly comfortable hotel. There are indeed many hotels, for the entertainment of tourists is the business of the place, which, as many travelers will remember, is seated upon the edge of a remarkably blue lake, a lake that it behooves every tourist to visit. The shore of the lake presents an unbroken array of establishments of this order, of every category, from the Grand Hotel of the newest fashion, with a chalk-white front, 100 balconies, and a dozen flags flying from its roof, to the little Swiss pension of an elder day, with its name inscribed in German-looking lettering upon a pink or yellow wall, and an awkward summer house in the angle of the garden. One of the hotels at Vevey, however, is famous, even classical, being distinguished from many of its upstart neighbors by an air both of luxury and of maturity. In this region, in the month of June, American travelers are extremely numerous. It may be said, indeed, that Vevey assumes at this period some of the characteristics of an American watering place. There are sights and sounds which evoke a vision, an echo of Newport and Saratoga. There's a flitting hither and thither of stylish young girls, a rustling of muslin flounces, a rattle of dance music in the morning hours, a sound of high-pitched voices at all times. You receive an impression of these things at the excellent inn of the Trois Couronnes, and are transported in fancy to the Ocean House or to Congress Hall. But at the Trois Couronnes, it must be added, there are other features that are much at variance with these suggestions. Neat German waiters who look like secretaries of legation, Russian princes sitting in the garden, little Polish boys walking about held by the hand, with their governors, a view of the sunny crest of the Dent du Midi, and the picturesque towers of the castle of Chillon. I hardly know whether it was the analogies of the differences that were uppermost in the mind of a young American who, 2 or 3 years ago, sat in the garden of the Trois Couronnes, looking about him rather idly at some of the graceful objects I have mentioned. It was a beautiful summer morning, and in whatever fashion the young American looked at things, they must have seemed to him charming. He had come from Geneva the day before by the little steamer to see his aunt, who was staying at the hotel, Geneva having been for a long time his place of residence. But his aunt had a headache. His aunt had almost always a headache, and now she was shut up in her room, smelling camphor, so that he was at liberty to wander about. He was some 27 years of age. When his friends spoke of him, they usually said that he was at Geneva, studying. When his enemies spoke of him, they said, but after all, he had no enemies. He was an extremely amiable fellow, and universally liked. What I should say is, simply, that when certain persons spoke of him, they affirmed that the reason of his spending so much time at Geneva was that he was extremely devoted to a lady who lived there. A foreign lady, a person older than himself. Very few Americans, indeed, I think none, had ever seen this lady, about whom there were some singular stories. But Winterbourne had an old attachment for the little metropolis of Calvinism. He had been put to school there as a boy, and he had afterward gone to college there, circumstances which had led to his forming a great many youthful friendships. Many of these he had kept, and they were a source of great satisfaction to him. After knocking at his aunt's door and learning that she was indisposed, he had taken a walk about the town, and then he had come in to his breakfast. He had now finished his breakfast, but he was drinking a small cup of coffee, which had been served him on a little table in the garden by one of the waiters who looked like an attaché. At last, he finished his coffee and lit a cigarette. Presently, a small boy came walking along the path, an urchin of 9 or 10. The child, who was diminutive for his years, had an aged expression of countenance, a pale complexion, and sharp little features. He was dressed in knickerbockers with red stockings, which displayed his poor little spindle shanks. He also wore a brilliant red cravat. He carried in his hand a long alpenstock, the sharp point of which he thrust into everything that he approached, the flower beds, the garden benches, the trains of ladies' dresses. In front of Winterbourne, he paused, looking at him with a pair of bright, penetrating little eyes. "Will you give me a lump of sugar?" he asked in a sharp, hard little voice, a voice immature and yet somehow not young. Winterbourne glanced at the small table near him, on which his coffee service rested, and saw that several morsels of sugar remained. "Yes, you may take one," he answered, "but I don't think sugar is good for little boys." This little boy stepped forward and carefully selected 3 of the coveted fragments, 2 of which he buried in the pocket of his knickerbockers, depositing the others promptly in another place. He poked his alpenstock, lance fashion, into Winterbourne's bench and tried to crack the lump of sugar with his teeth. "Oh, blazes, it's hard!" he exclaimed, pronouncing the adjective in a peculiar manner. Winterbourne had immediately perceived that he might have the honor of claiming him as a fellow countryman. "Take care you don't hurt your teeth," he said paternally. "I haven't got any teeth to hurt. They've all come out. I've only got 7 teeth. My mother counted them last night, and one came out right afterward. She said she'd slap me if any more came out. I can't help it. It's this old Europe. It's the climate that makes them come out. In America, they didn't come out. It's these hotels." Winterbourne was much amused. "If you eat 3 lumps of sugar, your mother will certainly slap you," he said. "She's got to give me some candy then," rejoined his young interlocutor. "I can't get any candy here. Any American candy. American candy is the best candy." "And are American little boys the best little boys?" asked Winterbourne. "I don't know. I'm an American boy," said the child. "I see you are one of the best," laughed Winterbourne. "Are you an American man?" pursued this vivacious infant. And then, on Winterbourne's affirmative reply, "American men are the best," he declared. His companion thanked him for the compliment, and the child, who had now got astride of his alpenstock, stood looking about him while he attacked a second lump of sugar. Winterbourne wondered if he himself had been like this in his infancy, for he had been brought to Europe at about this age. "Here comes my sister," cried the child in a moment. "She's an American girl." Winterbourne looked along the path and saw a beautiful young lady advancing. "American girls are the best girls," he said cheerfully to his young companion. "My sister ain't the best," the child declared. "She's always blowing at me." "I imagine that is your fault, not hers," said Winterbourne. The young lady, meanwhile, had drawn near. She was dressed in white muslin, with 100 frills and flounces, and knots of pale-colored ribbon. She was bareheaded, but she balanced in her hand a large parasol, with a deep border of embroidery, and she was strikingly, admirably pretty. "How pretty they are," thought Winterbourne, straightening himself in his seat, as if he were preparing to rise. The young lady paused in front of his bench, near the parapet of the garden, which overlooked the lake. The little boy had now converted his alpenstock into a vaulting pole, by the aid of which he was springing about in the gravel and kicking it up not a little. "Randolph," said the young lady, "what are you doing?" "I'm going up the Alps," replied Randolph. "This is the way." Then he gave another little jump, scattering the pebbles about Winterbourne's ears. "That's the way they come down," said Winterbourne. "He's an American man," cried Randolph in his little hard voice. The young lady gave no heed to this announcement, but looked straight at her brother. "Well, I guess you had better be quiet," she simply observed. It seemed to Winterbourne that he had been in a manner presented. He got up and stepped slowly toward the young girl, throwing away his cigarette. "This little boy and I have made acquaintance," he said, with great civility. In Geneva, as he had been perfectly aware, a young man was not at liberty to speak to a young unmarried lady except under certain rarely occurring conditions. But here at Vevey, what conditions could be better than these? A pretty American girl coming and standing in front of you in a garden? This pretty American girl, however, on hearing Winterbourne's observation, simply glanced at him. She then turned her head and looked over the parapet, at the lake and the opposite mountains. He wondered whether he had gone too far, but he decided that he must advance further, rather than retreat. While he was thinking of something else to say, the young lady turned to the little boy again. "I should like to know where you got that pole," she said. "I bought it," responded Randolph. "You don't mean to say you're going to take it to Italy?" Yes, I am going to take it to Italy, the child declared. The young girl glanced over the front of her dress and smoothed out a knot or two of ribbon. Then she rested her eyes upon the prospect again. Well, I guess you'd better leave it somewhere, she said after a moment. Are you going to Italy? Winterbourne inquired, in a tone of great respect. The young lady glanced at him again. Yes, sir, she replied, and she said nothing more. That is it for today. If you're interested in hearing and reading more, then visit gutenberg.org. Hope you enjoy.